Yeah.
You're here because, like us, you want to get a handle on these really big, complex, global issues, but without feeling totally overwhelmed, right?
Exactly.
So let's dive straight in. There's this recent, pretty thorough analysis asking a really critical question. Are we seeing some unsettling echoes of the periods just before the World Wars?
Indeed. And it's important to say this isn't about, just drawing some vague historical parallels.
Yeah.
The analysis we're digging into is much more structured. It looks at civilization through four key lenses: social, economic, political, and military.
Mhm.
And it does that across three specific times: before World War I, before World War II, and, well, right now.
Right. So our goal here in this deep dive is to pull out the really important insights from that framework to try and get a grip on what these historical rhymes, I suppose, might be telling us about today.
Yeah, where the resonances are.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the social dimension and this kind of fascinating, sometimes unsettling idea about technological progress.
Yes, what's really interesting, or maybe worrying, is how the analysis suggests that these big technological leaps, while they bring benefits, they also consistently stir things up socially, create disruption.
How so?
Well, think back before World War I, the Second Industrial Revolution. You had electricity, mass production,
Yeah.
huge changes. But they also displaced a lot of workers, weakened old hierarchies like monarchies, the church.
Right.
And you saw the rise of these really intense nationalist movements, labor movements.
Right.
It was a time of, well, profound social stress.
And then fast forward a bit towards World War II, the tech anxieties shifted, didn't they? The article mentions things like the word robot appearing.
Yeah, that fear of automation starting to creep in. And crucially, the rise of mass media radio, film being used very effectively for propaganda, which just amplified fear, amplified polarization. It does sound quite familiar, doesn't it?
It really does. And if you connect that to our current digital revolution, AI, smartphones, social media, I mean, they've totally reshaped how we communicate, how we work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the analysis makes this compelling point. Social media, which we maybe thought would connect everyone, it's actually paradoxically mirroring that pre-WWI nationalist press. It creates these echo chambers,
Yeah.
reinforcing biases, making it really hard to understand people with different views. A bit of a far cry from the initial promise.
And we're also dealing with all these other anxieties now, AI taking jobs, privacy worries, the impact of screens. It all echoes those earlier tech shifts.
It does. So the key takeaway here seems to be that innovation itself isn't the issue, but societies often struggle to adapt quickly enough. That lag creates instability.
That makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's look at the economic dimension.
Yep.
The article presents two sort of competing ideas about economics and war.
Yes, and it's really crucial to understand both perspectives. First, there's the idea that, strong economic ties should prevent conflict.
The interdependence argument.
Exactly. Before World War I, Britain and Germany were huge trading partners,
Yeah.
deeply interconnected. The thinking was war would be economic suicide for both.
But it happened anyway.
It happened anyway, which tells us something important. Economics might show what's possible, cooperation, mutual benefit. But politics, ambition, fear, miscalculation, that's what often decides what actually happens.
Right. So just because countries trade a lot doesn't guarantee peace. What's the second perspective then?
This one is maybe even more sobering. It's the idea that relative power often matters more than absolute wealth, how countries see themselves compared to others.
Okay, explain that.
So leading up to World War II, you had Germany and Japan. Their economies were actually growing, but they felt disadvantaged. They felt boxed in by the established powers, Britain, France, the U.S. This perception, this feeling of being unfairly treated, of not having their rightful place, fueled their drive for autarky, economic self-sufficiency.
Becoming independent.
Right. And ultimately, it contributed to their aggression. They wanted to forcibly change the global pecking order.
And that resonates obviously with the U.S.-China relationship today. There's this common assumption still that because our economies are so linked, major conflict is, well, almost unthinkable.
But the analysis warns against that simplification. It points out that perception of relative decline or the fear of being overtaken can be a powerful driver.
And it also highlights this post-COVID trend, doesn't it? Nations wanting to be more self-reliant, bringing industries back home.
Yes, that focus on national resilience, securing supply chains. It does sound an awful lot like that push for autarky in the 1930s. It's a worrying parallel.
So the insight is, it's not just about how rich a country is, but how it stacks up against rivals. That feeling of losing ground can be more dangerous.
Precisely. That perception of relative disadvantage can be a much stronger catalyst for conflict than just being poor. Okay, so let's move on to the political dimension. This feels increasingly relevant.
Absolutely. The analysis really hammers home how extreme political polarization can, well, eat away at democracy and pave the way for actual violence.
We see it so clearly before World War I in the Balkans. That region was just fractured by deep political divides, intense nationalism.
Yeah.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand wasn't just some random act. It was, the boiling point of this incredibly polarized environment.
And then the Weimar Republic before World War II, political assassinations, street militias fighting.
A complete breakdown of order. It created the vacuum that authoritarianism then filled.
And disturbingly, the analysis points to things happening now. The January 6th Capitol riot in the U.S. is mentioned, thousands of politically motivated attacks in Germany.
It really underscores how fragile democratic institutions can be when facing that level of internal division, when you have armed factions or widespread questioning of legitimate authority.
It's deeply concerning, even the way online discourse sometimes feels, that level of hostility. It feels like a symptom.
It could well be. And the critical point the analysis makes is this. When polarization gets so bad that violence starts to seem like a legitimate political tool for some, then compromise becomes impossible. And historically, when that happens, the odds of wider conflict just shoot way up.
Okay. So that leads us logically to the military dimension and alliances. This part of the analysis felt particularly immediate.
Yes, it's very thought-provoking. The core idea is how alliances can act as multipliers, turning what might have been a regional issue into a global catastrophe.
World War I being the classic case.
Absolutely. A dispute between Austria and Serbia triggered this cascade through the alliance system, dragging everyone else in.
Yeah.
Textbook example.
And before World War II, you had these separate regional ambitions, Germany in Europe, Italy in Africa, Japan in Asia, but they eventually merged, didn't they? Especially once the U.S. got involved, partly due to alliances.
Precisely. And the analysis draws a line from that to today, pointing to three potential flashpoints. Russia and Ukraine, obviously, Iran's proxy wars across the Middle East, and China's stance on Taiwan.
Any one of those could spark something bigger.
But what the analysis really highlights as new and significant is what it calls a potential new axis of dictatorships. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. And the argument is this isn't just a loose alignment like the 1930s axis. It suggests a much deeper integration.
How integrated?
Well, you have reports of North Korean arms, maybe even troops, going to Russia. China providing vital economic and tech support to Iran and North Korea. China buying up Russian oil and gas, which, helps fund Russia's war effort.
That's a level of coordination.
It's significant. And the analysis contrasts this with what it perceives as potential fracturing, or at least a lack of complete cohesion within the Western alliance, NATO, for example.
Which could reduce deterrence.
Potentially, yes. Now, someone might argue, quite reasonably, that the Western economies are still so deeply linked that war remains irrational. The costs are too high.
Right. That interdependence argument again. How does the analysis counter that?
It acknowledges the economic ties, absolutely. But it argues that the perception of weakening Western resolve or disunity could embolden adversaries. The visible integration of the authoritarian bloc-sharing resources, military kit, presents a different picture. It might increase their incentive to act decisively, maybe calculating that the West will be too slow or too divided to respond effectively.
So the coherence of an alliance matters as much as its raw power.
That's the crucial insight here, yes. Alliances aren't just defensive pacts. Their perceived strength and unity can dramatically shape the calculations of others.
Wow. Okay, so pulling all these threads together, the social disruption from tech, the economic rivalry based on relative power, the dangerous political polarization, and now these shifting alliance dynamics. It really does feel like Mark Twain's famous line, doesn't it? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
It certainly feels that way. Across all four dimensions, these patterns, these rhymes of the past, are, well, they're hard to ignore.
But, and this is important, the analysis itself stresses this isn't fate, right? It's not saying World War III is inevitable.
Absolutely not. These are trends, parallels, maybe foreshadowing, as you said earlier, but they aren't a predetermined script. The future isn't written.
Which leaves a pretty big question hanging in the air for you, the listener.
Given these interconnected trends we've just discussed, social, economic, political, military. How do you see them potentially interacting, amplifying each other?
Yeah, and maybe more importantly, what can actually be done? What proactive steps could individuals or societies or governments take to navigate these challenges, to steer away from repeating those tragic historical rhymes?
That's definitely something worth thinking deeply about.